The battle for Ocheretyne has been one of the most dramatic and high stakes of the entire front line. But is the real story behind the battle even more crazy than any of us knew? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about it. So, for those of you that haven't been tuned into the channel for the last week, while a lot of the media has been focused on Russian efforts to take this town of CRAZIER, you can see Russian efforts to do so have been pretty muted. However, if you've been following this channel, you know that the real fighting has been near Ocheretyne. And the reason is pretty simple. Ukrainians established this pretty robust defensive line near the town of Berdychi using this river and reservoir system as kind of a de facto barrier, keeping the Russians to the east and south of this river, and using the hills around Umansky, Semenivka, and Berdychi in order to establish good firing positions to observe and destroy any Russian efforts to cross this river. And it's worked great, so much so that the Russians needed to find a new way to solve their problem. They had to go around this defensive line. And for Russia, they saw this rail line protected by wooded areas leading to Ocheretyne. And they believed that if they could seize Ocheretyne, that they could turn the entire defensive line, forcing the Ukrainian line to collapse when attacked from the side. It's a time-honored tactic, something that even a U.S. Civil War general would find familiar. And Russia appears to have been succeeding. And as we work back in time, you can see that Russian forces have been able to systematically push into this salient, but most dramatically, it appears to have happened about 2 weeks ago, right? Here we are on the 12th, and you can see as we advance day by day, Russian forces actually making a pretty huge breakthrough by Russian standards into Ocheretyne. You can see they've seized the town and are now expanding into Novobatmutivka and towards Solovyovo. This is not great news for Ukrainian forces who probably should be, I suspect, are considering withdrawing to this defensive position here. Sokil, Yenihivka, and this river and reservoir system here, where they'll be able to occupy some more defensible hilltop positions. Of course, in the process, it would mean Ukraine would have to yield a large chunk of territory, admittedly fairly empty territory, but easily, I'm going to say, a 10 by 10 kilometer chunk to Russian forces. And that's not something the Ukrainians want to be doing. Now, when you look at the actual story of this fighting, it gets even more absurd. And this comes to us from actually David Axe, who is the founder of War is Boring and a Iraq war reporter who covered the ridiculousness of a disappearing Ukrainian brigade. Now, the story is that the 47th Mechanized Brigade, right, is one of Ukraine's premier NATO-trained and equipped brigades. It was meant to be the flagship brigade of the big counter-offensive. But, of course, they took a lot of casualties and never really saw the kind of breakthrough success that they were hoping to have the 47th Mech spearhead. But that's because they were so well-trained and so well-equipped, they have been sent basically from heavy fighting to heavy fighting, including in the defense of Avdiivka. So, as the Russians pushed out of Avdiivka, the 47th was deployed and reinforced the city through fighting a delaying action, allowing the garrison to retreat. And then the 47th was instructed to man positions near Ocheretyne, right? This was their line. They were supposed to be the north anchor to this Berdychi, Semenivka, Umansky line, right? They were going to be the northern front that anchored this whole thing, right? Where they expected the Russians, again, to be most likely to try to stage a breakthrough because, you see, there's no river here to stop the Russians from crossing. So, but the 47th has been pretty much in continuous combat for a year straight, which is unbelievable. And so Ukrainian High Command was like, the 47th, not only are their people exhausted, but their equipment is exhausted as well. They need to fix their Bradleys, repair their Abrams, get new parts, new supplies, do the maintenance that undoubtedly should have been done probably months ago. And so they were going to be replaced by the Ukrainian 115th Mechanized Brigade. Obviously not a not a flagship brigade like the 47th, but perfectly capable. However, it sounds like what they describe is something went wrong. And the essentially the way it's described by one of the 47th Mech Brigade commanders, he said, quote, certain units just fucked off. And this is where things get weird. Now, of course, Russian scouts and drones, which are obviously always monitoring these positions, were expecting to see the 47th withdraw and find fresh troops, well-equipped troops from the 115th. But instead, there was no one in the positions. And so as a result, Russia's 30th Army rolled right through. That's why this looks like they're rolling right through. It appears that they are just charging into this Ocheretyne region because literally that's what they're doing. It looks like they're not meeting any resistance because they aren't. Now, here's where things get interesting, right? You can see here that according to the story, the 47th Mech Brigade, the only reason that the Russians didn't totally collapse the Berdichi line is because the 47th turned right around and went back into the fight. So you can see it happen kind of as it plays out here, right? Here's the 12th, likely when I suspect the relief in place is what it's called. When one unit withdraws and another unit takes their place, it's called a RIP, or relief in place. So here's where I suspect the relief in place was supposed to happen. As you can see, boom, 14th, the Russians realize, hey, there's no one in these positions. Then they start surging in, pouring troops in as fast as they can, running towards Ocheretyne. And you can see right about here on the 17th, you watch Russian forces actually have their salient compressed just a little bit. And this is likely because right here, the 17th to the 18th is when you saw the 47th Mech turn around and go back into the fighting again. And over the next several days, while the Russians continued to expand their salient, the 47th is fighting to delay this effort. But again, the 47th, they're not infinite. They're human beings with, modern but still imperfect technology. And fighting in an army that has a real shortage of equipment. So it's a tall order. And you can see here that the 47th Mechanized has managed to delay this action, right? What hasn't happened is the most important thing, which is the collapse of the Berdichi line. That has not happened. That has remained intact. And I suspect that it's even possible that the 47th may have been instructed, hey, listen, don't try to stop them penetrating into Ocheretyne. Stop them from flanking south. And you can see they look like they've kind of been held here near Novobatmutivka and Solovyova. And I suspect that Ukrainians may just be like, it's okay to lose these villages. If it means forcing, what the Russians can't do is begin to collapse this Berdichi line. That's the worst case scenario that they have to avoid. And so the fact is that things are even more complicated now than they were here. Now, what do they mean by certain units just fucked off? We're going to talk about that in a second. But if you are having one of those days where you feel like you're going to collapse, I don't know how this transition works, but man, listen, I'm doing my best here. You don't have to depend on a questionable Ukrainian brigade. You have Strike Gum, right? 90 milligrams caffeine, 100 milligrams alpha GPC, 0 sugar. So if you're interested, you can check it out at strikegum.com, where you can get the veteran discounts and the new customer discounts, but you can also get it on Amazon.com. Just go to Amazon, search for Strike Gum, or check the link in the description and pick some up. And a huge thank you to the dozens of people who've left us 5-star reviews on Amazon, because that makes a massive difference in terms of other customers from Amazon who are like, hey, where can I find a military grade caffeinated gum? Well, they know. And you know too. So check us out, strikegum.com. Okay, so what's the situation in Ocheretyne now? Well, the answer is that after the 30th, right, the Russian 30th pushed into Ocheretyne, and the 47th turned around and counterattacked, driving, at least bloodying their nose and stopping their advance. The 115th, well, nobody really knows. Now, it says the 115th was supposed to take, this is a follow-up article, 115th supposed to take over the 47th Mech Brigade's place in Ocheretyne, right? But nobody really knows. And the Ukrainians, desperate, not even sure where the 115th is, ended up having to deploy something called the 100th Mechanized Brigade. And the 100th is a former territorial brigade, right? So roughly the equivalent of a National Guard unit that had been activated and turned into an active army unit. And as it points out, there aren't any inexperienced units here. It's a little bit like 2006, 7, and 8 in the Iraq War. In terms of combat time, at that time, reserve component and National Guard troops were actually just as combat experienced as their active duty counterparts. And in some ways, the National Guard units were better because many of the leadership in active duty units got their combat time, deployed stateside, and then were promoted to new roles where they had zero experience, right? They were at the next higher role. Whereas a lot of National Guard units, many people don't ever really leave their post. They say, "Oh, I'm the commander of this unit, and I've been the commander of this unit for 7 years," right? So National Guard or even part-time in the context of a war doesn't really mean that much. So these 2,000 troopers have have done a lot of the fighting, but what the brigade doesn't have is heavy equipment. There's no Western tanks, no fighting vehicles, no artillery, right? They're a Soviet-style equipped brigade. The 100th Mech, of course, was absolutely game and continued to blunt the Russian 30th Brigade. As remember, once Russia realized there was this opportunity for a breakthrough, Soviet doctrine is clear. When you achieve a breakthrough, you pour troops into it. You just pile them in. It's a very simple but very effective tactic, and you can literally see them do it, right? Imagine you're a Soviet commander or you're a Russian commander, and you stage this breakthrough, which happened on the 16th, and then you begin to just flood the area with all available troops, committing your reserves to the fight. And so Ukraine, in turn, is having the 100th Mech really lead this defense. And what's important is you've got this brigade running this defense. Crucially, the most important thing, while Russia has broken through and seized a number of towns and villages, the most important thing, the Berdichi line here, remains intact, right? Russia remains on the correct side of this line, largely. They are a little past in Semenivka. They may or may not have crossed here at Berdichi, but the total collapse and folding of the Ukrainian forces, we haven't seen that happen yet, basically through the efforts of this 100th Mech Brigade. And their counterattack. It says that actually, according to Deep State map, they said that the 100th Mech actually did counterattack near Prohes, which doesn't appear on this map, strangely enough. Yeah, I don't see it anywhere on here. But it may be a different name for Berdichi or for Solovyova. I'm not sure. But the fact is that this is a sign of some level of trouble, right? Because Ukraine simply may not have the fresh units to win all of these fights, right? Russia continuously is mobilizing tens of thousands of troops every single month, and Ukraine needs to stand up more of its troops. It's hoping that its changes to their conscription law, plus the $60 billion in Western aid will combine in such a way that it will enable Ukraine to produce fresh combat brigades who can assume some of the fighting, and they can actually start to have a troop rotation system. Right now, there really hasn't been. And the idea, of course, is that more of these brigades will be able to distribute the hardest fighting further around, so they're not depending entirely on the 47th. Now, what do I mean? What does he mean when he says some units fucked off? And this is where things kind of bother me. This is what sort of sticks with me a little bit, is that when you are getting a relief in place, right? And it happened in Afghanistan all the time, right? You'd be in charge of a sector and you would be expected to say, listen, the next unit's going to follow on. And they are going to arrive at your location. You're going to orient them to the position, and then you're going to leave and they're going to stay. That's a relief in place. And so the whole thing only happens if you wait for your other unit to show up. And that's where things get weird. I understand, like undoubtedly, the 47th exhausted, and it's not clear where the 115th is now. But reality happens to units, right? The 115th could have been delayed because of a communication error, could have been delayed because someone else gave them different orders, or because another sector of the front was even more critically in need than the current one, right? All of these things could happen. And command doesn't always give orders. And this is one of the core aspects of what's called mission command versus a Soviet style of leadership. The Soviet style of command says that you receive an order, and your order is withdraw from this position. You will follow that order, you will withdraw at the given time, and you won't really ask too many questions. A U.S. unit, a NATO unit fighting what used to be called air-land battle, is now full spectrum operations, I think, is instead going to ask questions like, hey, I know I'm supposed to withdraw from these positions, or I'm not. I'm supposed to conduct a rip in these positions, ending with a withdrawal. They say the unit hasn't arrived yet, so I should not abandon these positions, right? Like, I can't leave this position until the other unit shows up. And so the fact that the 47th didn't do this, I think that might be the indicator of the units who fucked off, who were, like, you understand where they're at emotionally. You've been fighting for a year. You finally get told you're going to get put to the rear, and then your relief never shows up. And that is crushingly demoralizing. It's hard to understate how demoralizing it must be to have been involved in absolutely only the heaviest fighting of the war for a year straight, and then your relief just no-shows. But as you can see, acting out of frustration produces some really disastrous results. And the 47th, here's the thing. Here's what sucks. The 47th is still in the fighting anyway. They had to turn around and get back to the fighting business. And so they were going to be stuck in these positions anyway. But by leaving before the 115th showed up, because here's the thing. Remember, guys, like individual soldiers man these positions at the platoon, at the squad level, and no one showed up to these places. And they still were like, meh, the Russians are right over there. We're just going to bail. And again, it's a sign, I think, an indicator of the exhaustion of the Ukrainian armed forces, right? Especially units like the 47th. These guys are volunteers. They don't want to do the wrong thing. They don't want to just up and leave. But when you have a unit that you haven't rotated out in so long, you get these kind of outcomes. But this is where leadership comes in. This is where the NATO mentality comes in, which is ask the question that says, hey, listen, are you sure you want me to leave? No one else is in this position. No one else is relieving here. We are abandoning this defensive position that we've established. Are you sure you want us to empty out this trench? And some units may have said that, but someone somewhere should have said, wait till your relief shows up, right? Like, again, a relief in place is a soldier-to-soldier exchange. You come in, and literally you should see the soldier from the 115th Mech who says, yo, what's up? I'm Sergeant Snuffy. I'm going to be taking over your dugout, your fighting position, your trench. And that should happen in every position across the entire front line. So again, I'm not going to sit there and like blame the 47th. I'm not going to sit there and blame the 115th, right? But somebody should not have just up and left their positions. And they did, right? And again, I think it is an indicator of the exhaustion of the Ukrainian armed forces. And I hope that, again, between the addition of aid that will enable them to stop Russian attacks before they start, and combined with a larger mobilization of Ukrainian troops, that you're going to start to see more of these units get rest cycles, refit cycles, the ability to replenish their combat power meaningfully. Anyway, guys, that is all I had. Of course, thank you to the Colonel tier members of combatvetnews.com. Thank you to the Lieutenant tier members. I could not do this without you guys. I really appreciate you. Be sure to subscribe and hit like on the video, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.